The Duke of Rivigo and Countess Cazes remained on board between 2 and 3 hours, during which time I had a great deal of conversation with them on the state of affairs in France, in which they did all they could to impress me with the idea that Bonaparte was not reduced to the necessity of quitting Europe, but that in doing so he was actuated solely by motives of humanity, being unwilling, they said, that any further effusion of blood should take place on his account. They declared also that his party was still very formidable in the center and south of France, and that if he chose to protract the war, he might still give a great deal of trouble, and that although his ultimate success might not be probable, there was still a possibility of fortune turning in his favor, and therefore they argued it was in the interest of England to allow him to proceed to America. To all this I could give little or no reply, being quite ignorant of what had occurred in France, further than the decisive victory obtained by the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo. During the time the Frenchmen were with me, I received some French newspapers from Sir Henry Hotham, but my time was so fully occupied in writing to him and in discussions with my visitors that it was not in my power to read them. I therefore drew them back to the subject that had occasioned their visit and said, supposing the British government should be induced to grant a passport for Bonaparte's going to America, what pledge could he give that he would not return and put England, as well as all Europe, to the same expense of blood and treasure that has just been incurred? General Savary made the following reply. When the Emperor first abdicated the throne of France, his removal was brought about by a faction, at the head of which was Talleyrand, and the sense of the nation was not consulted, but in the present instance he has voluntarily resigned the power. The influence he once had over the French people is past. A very considerable change has taken place in their sentiments towards him since he went to Elba, and he could never regain the power he had over their minds. Therefore, he would prefer retiring in obscurity, where he might end his days in peace and tranquility, and where he solicited to ascend the throne again, he would decline it. If that is the case, I said, why not ask an asylum in England? He answered, there are many reasons for his not wishing to reside in England. The climate is too damp and cold. It is too near France. He would be, as it were, in the center of every change and revolution that might take place there, and would be subject to suspicion. He has been accustomed to consider the English as his most inveterate enemies, and they have been induced to look upon him as a monster without one of the virtues of a human being. This conversation took place while I was writing my dispatches to Sir Henry Hotham, and the Frenchmen were walking in the cabin, frequently interrupting me to enforce their statement of Bonaparte's situation being by no means so desperate as might be supposed, from which I took the liberty of drawing a conclusion directly opposite to the one they were desirous of impressing in my mind. Captain Knight of the Falmouth, who carried my dispatches to the Admiral, was present during the whole of this conversation, but did not join in it. This was the first certain information I had received of Bonaparte's position since the Battle of Waterloo. Tuesday the 11th, about noon, a small boat came off from the island of Oleron to where the ship was at anchor in Basque Roads, rowed by 4 men, in which sat 2 respectable-looking countrymen, who asked for the captain, and upon my being pointed out to them, requested to speak with me in private. When shown into the cabin, where I went, accompanied by Captain Gambier of the Myrmidon, they acquainted me that a text had been sent from the Isle d'Aix early that morning for a man who was considered the best pilot on the island for the Mamison passage, being the only person that had ever taken a frigate through. Not a large sum of money had been offered to him to pilot a vessel to sea from the passage, and that it certainly was Bonaparte's intention to escape from thence, either in the corvette which had moved down some days before, or in a Danish brig, which was then lying at anchor near the entrance. On receiving this information, I immediately got under way, and though the flood tide had just made and beat the ships out of the Perdius d'Antioch before it was dark, and I sent the Myrmidon off the Mamison, with orders to anchor close with the entrance when the weather would admit of it, while I remained with the Bellerophon and Cellini, which joined me that evening under way between the lighthouses.